Hello, Darren Jones. Keir Starmer said that net migration was shockingly high. So what would the right level be?
Well, he said that because, of course, the numbers of work visas that have gone out in the last data set are much, much higher than normal. And so the question is, why is that much higher than normal?
No, our question was, what would a reasonable level be?
One of them. Well, the normal level is a couple of 100,000 a year, but it depends on the needs in the economy. And that's why the really important question is, if there are lots of vacancies in the economy, why have we got people who are out of work in the UK who should be able to access training and skills and access the jobs that exist in their local area? And that's why this is an abnormal set of numbers. It's an abnormally high number of work visas, especially into the health and social care system.
Because unemployment is at record lows and these systems are on their knees, Darren. In fact, they're accepting the narrative. See what I mean? I go on about narrativization and that the Labour just continually allow the Conservative Party and other parties on the right to set where the agenda is, to set what the narrative is. And they say, well, actually, they've got this huge problem. And I'm like, oh, yeah, we agree that there's a huge problem. Why on earth are we bringing in care workers and nurses from overseas? Because we don't have any care workers and nurses in the UK at the moment, right? If you want to go and spend a bunch of money training people to do it, fine, go ahead. I would welcome you to do it. But trying to get unemployment any lower would put it below the NIRU, which then might get us back into an inflationary spiral all over again. And then after that, on top of that, any training that you do is going to take years to administer when the problems in social care and in nursing are happening now, immediately. Right at this moment, you're going to bring back the nurses' bursary, for example, as well, right? The nurses' bursary is a massive thing that got cut during the austerity years that's impacting our recruitment of nurses in the UK. You're going to bring that back, but there's no room for day-to-day spending. Nothing that Rachel Reeves thinks she can spend a wealth tax on, unless that's part of your NHS workforce plan from what little money you'll get from the non-dom tax status. This doesn't make any sense. What are you going to do about social care if you just cut off all of these visas?
Which reflects problems in the way that the NHS is being run by the government.
And we've been discussing that already, and thank you for dealing with a slight delay on the line there, but you mentioned a couple of 100,000 as being a normal figure. So if Labour wins the election, should people then expect that you would be looking to set immigration levels at around about a couple of 100,000 a year as a normal kind of level?
Well, the Conservatives have tried to set targets and caps and failed every single year whilst they've had them. What we have to do is make sure that where there are problems, and the prime example here is the health and social care system, that we're getting to the root cause of the problem where we don't have sufficient labour availability locally here in the UK. And that's for two reasons in the National Health Service. One is because we need a proper NHS workforce plan, which my colleague Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary, has set out in detail. But the second is because we do need to improve the productivity of our public services so that they're more efficient, so that you don't need as many people in order to be able to run.
They're going on about efficiency savings as well. What's efficiency savings? Where? You're already saying you're going to make it more efficient by more privatisation. We've already know that fails, right? Despite the fact that Wes Streeting is continuing this nonsense about extra spare capacity in the NHS private sector, which is not a thing that exists. What do you mean efficiency savings? There isn't. David Cameron spent 6 years trying efficiency savings, and all it got us was a collapsing health service. There were no efficiency savings. What the hell are you talking about, Darren?
Them, and that's why ultimately we're relying on a lot of overseas labour to come in and keep the show on the road. And we're very grateful for their contribution, but it's actually reflexive of underlying problems in our public services that need modernising.
But how quickly, though, do you think, if you win the next election, you could make a difference to that? You've outlined the exceptional circumstances that have led to the numbers being so high, but how fast could you make a change if you win the election?
Well, there's some immediate things that we can do. That's why we've said that we will close the non-dom tax status and put over £1 billion to support overtime payments in the National Health Service to get through the backlog, which is still very, very large and increasing since the COVID pandemic. But that's a short-term issue. The reason Keir Starmer talks about mission-oriented government and an end to sticking plaster politics is because I have to be very frank with you, it's going to take time.
Yeah, sticking plaster politics is essentially just finding efficiency savings.
to fix some of these problems, because after 13 years of the Conservatives in government, we have deep structural problems in our country.
So how quickly
in our
then do you
economy,
think
in
we
our
could
labour
make a
market, and in our
difference
public
to the
services.
immigration numbers? Do you think that the business of getting migration to what you described as a normal level of a couple of 100,000 a year, would that be something Labour would hope to achieve in the first term of government if you win?
I think we probably would hope to do that, yes, but we've talked about a decade of national renewal, not because we're being presumptuous about this election or indeed the next one, but because we think the deep structural problems that we've been left from the Conservatives after the last 13 years is going to take time to fix, and it's going to take time to turn around. But the one thing you can be sure of is that after 13 years of the Conservatives in government, they've created these problems and they don't have the energy or the ideas to fix them, and we in the Labour Party will.
Except you don't have the ideas. And second of all, literally their position, as it basically entirely will be from now until the election, is just, we are not the Tories, please vote for us, right? And they still say, well, we can bring down all these immigration numbers and just get people out of the current pool of unemployed people, right? When, for people who don't realise, when I say NAIRU, what I mean is this, so the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, which is essentially that there is a theoretical level to which unemployment only goes so low before the number of people looking for work starts a wage price spiral effectively, right? Where the bargaining power of labour pushes up the cost of labour so much to the point at which prices continually go up to compensate, to maintain profits, and again, creates a wage price spiral.
If we get the chance to serve the country.
Well, we want to talk about Europe.
We're not at that. Sort of remember the inflationary pressures we had were from supply chain shocks and from import prices that have now gone back to kind of similar to normal levels, which is why we have greedflation at the moment and there is no wage price spiral. It's worth to understand that this isn't what's happening right now, but it's what could happen if unemployment went any lower than it already has been recently.
Policies rather than your criticisms of the government. But let's talk about how you would act on public spending. Now, as the man with the calculator, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury shadow, you've already mentioned it's going to be tough, it's going to be tight, but you backed the Tories' tax cuts they announced this week. The implication of backing those tax cuts is that you back a squeeze on public spending that's been penciled in to pay for them. So where do you think in government money could be cut?
Well, let's be clear, there was a headline tax cut in national insurance this week, which we do support because the tax burden on working people is the highest it has been for many decades. Families are on average spending £4,000 a year more in tax. They've got a couple £100 back now from the national insurance cut, and that's welcome, but it's really taking with one hand once you've already, giving with one hand once you've already taken a lot more money with the other hand. But the broader question there is we've got one other budget coming up in February, March time next year. We need to see what the final books are before we go into the next election, and we will set out that detail in our manifesto once we've had the chance to see what the inheritance would be at the point of the next election. There's still more damage that the Conservatives could do to the country.
But you spend your...
So they're literally promising further deficit reduction measures. Does everybody remember that interview that I showed you from the 2015 election of Andrew Neil berating Lucy Powell and then her trying to articulate Labour's deficit reduction plan in 2015, right? When I keep saying that our media has essentially allowed us, so we have David Cameron, different clones of him, being Prime Minister for life, essentially, that's what we're here, despite nobody in the country wanting it, nobody voting for it in 2019. We now have an entire political force backing austerity cuts, right? You've got to remember, right, despite what Rachel Reeves says about 20 billion or whatever it is for the green investment plan, whatever they say about that, they've said it might happen, it might not. There's been a bunch of hoo-ha in the news about this, that potentially that might not happen and they're going to ramp up to it by the end of the parliament rather than happening initially. That's a specific thing about where they're engaging in fiscal expansion or running a deficit for this infrastructure spending on green energy, right? Put all of that aside and look at the rest of the budget. Because under Rachel Reeves' fiscal rules, they will only finance extra day-to-day spending with tax rises, right? So, if they're going to go into the election with no other tax rises other than the current non-dom tax status and private schools, which they've already allocated for the things they've talked about with NHS workforce expansion and free breakfast clubs, so that's all of that money earmarked, every single budget is going to have to say the same. So not raising any more taxes, and they say that all public spending on day-to-day spending is going to come from taxation receipts, right? So all of the money is all currently accounted for. So they're going to keep the same amount of austerity that they're going into the election with of what they have been promised to be given by Jeremy Hunt. So we're literally at the point exactly where we were in 2015 of Conservative Party saying, we're going to do austerity, and Labour saying, we're going to do austerity, but we're going to be nicer about it. And nobody wants this. Literally nobody wants this. I feel like I'm having a gigantic case of deja vu. There's just clones of David Cameron everywhere. I'm surrounded by them. They're inescapable. Someone clip that.
Life looking at this stuff, it is your job to look carefully at government spending. Can you name one part of the public sector where you think cuts could, perhaps should be made?
And this is Laura Kuenssberg doing exactly what Andrew Neil was doing in that Lucy Powell interview all of those 8 years ago, right? Exactly the same thing. What's your deficit reduction plan? Please explain what you can cut, where you're going to make cuts in terms of day-to-day spending. And Darren Jones going, we're going to find efficiency savings. It's the same thing.
Well, there are things, we call them switch spends. If you're referring to my time with the calculator and the Treasury team, there are things where we've already identified that there is things that the Conservatives currently spend money on not very effectively, that we think we could spend more effectively to solve problems, especially in the short term. One example of that actually is the asylum backlog, given that we've been talking about migration figures today, where there's been an underspend in certain budgets that we think we can spend on recruiting more senior caseworkers to make decisions more quickly. Another example, the capital budgets on school buildings had not been being spent very effectively, and yet we know we've got these problems with the RAC issue, with the safety of our schools. We would reprioritise those budgets to make.
But those budgets weren't being cut back through to inefficiencies. They were being moved over into day-to-day spending because of austerity cuts to that day-to-day spending in terms of the actual budget schools had access to. So if you want to increase capital investment in these schools, for example, then you're going to have to move even more money back out of day-to-day spending, which is austerity cuts. Unless you're promising to do even more fiscal expansion for this capital investment, which I would welcome. I would welcome that fiscal expansion. But Rachel Reeves has said herself that their only form of fiscal expansion is going to be this green prosperity plan for green investment, right? You think capital budgets are ring-fenced? They used to be, and then they weren't under George Osborne. Like, capital budgets got cut back to put more money into day-to-day spending because they got eaten into by day-to-day spending because regular budgets for day-to-day spending also got cut back.
Make sure those issues are being dealt with more quickly. So there's a whole host of things that we'd be able to do, but as I say, I can't give you the kind of full bells and whistles answer because we just don't know what the accounts are that we would be inheriting at the next election.
And what
until
about that
the
28
next budget
billion
has concluded, which we think will be in February or March.
What about that 28 billion that you've previously said you would spend a year on green investment by the end of the Parliament? Now, our colleagues in BBC News had a report that actually that might not happen by the end of the next Parliament after all. Are you committed to doing that or not?
Yes, we are committed to it, subject to our fiscal rules, and the one that's most relevant to this question is that we will get national debt falling as a percentage of the size of the economy by the next Parliament. But we're confident we can do both, and I'll just quickly explain why. One, where we are investing alongside business to have more secure energy supplies so that we can lower bills for people at home, where we're investing alongside business to create new jobs in the country, those activities will stimulate economic growth, which means that it will be easier to be able to get a return from those investments to pay off that debt and to get debt reducing as a percentage of the size of the economy. And the second thing to say is what we have said is we're going to ramp up to £28 billion a year towards the end of the next Parliament, because it will take time to spend that money effectively, and we will only spend it effectively, but also because after the Liz Truss...
And also only if it actually fits into the fiscal rules, right? They've already said that if they can't make it fit within the fiscal rules, the fiscal expansion won't happen. So if debt isn't falling as a percentage of GDP or not predicted to, then the investment isn't going to happen in the first place. So looking forward to that. Is his audio slightly behind the video? I think it is. You can also see his face in the background there. We can also see him watching. It's a bit of a Roborus of Darren Jones, which is not something I ever thought I would have to deal with. Very nightmarish.
Quasi-Kwarteng period in government, the cost of borrowing for the country is much higher than it was in the past, and we will only borrow to invest alongside business where it's prudent to do so and subject to our fiscal rules.
Darren Jones, thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning. Good to have you on the programme, introducing the concept of the switch spend. That might be something we hear more about in the years to come. Now, are you...
Which is essentially just saying we're keeping day-to-day spending budgets the same because we aren't raising taxes, and we said that day-to-day spending can only come from taxes, right? So look forward to more Section 114 notices in the future, chat. Looking forward to that. Hey there, if you enjoyed the video, make sure that you like and leave a comment. That helps the video out in the algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it'll let you know when I go live. I stream every day on YouTube and Twitch. You can also follow all of my socials down in the description. And if you want to support me in a more financial manner, there's a join button for memberships. It's just 99p to be a member on YouTube, as well as a Patreon, and there's some merch there as well. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.